For some political analysis, we'd now like to welcome our panel. Susan Page is the Washington bureau chief of USA Today. Jonah Goldberg is a senior editor of the National Review. And Susan Glasser writes about the presidency and foreign policy for The New Yorker. Susan Glasser, I want to start with you on the question of Jamal Khashoggi. Put all the pieces in order for us of this issue, why it's a challenge for the White House, and what you expect next.
Well, first of all, look, this is a story I think that really has captured the attention of Washington and many capitals around the world, because it seems to so directly implicate not just this horrific question of this Saudi dissident journalist who's in self-imposed exile here in the United States, writing column for the Washington Post. He's broken with the leadership of Saudi Arabia, and it appears to be a very personal feud with the young crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. But that's also why it's a Washington story. President Trump, and in particular his son-in-law Jared Kushner, have made the relationship extremely personal with Saudi Arabia. They've doubled down on America's traditional alliance with the Saudis. Jared Kushner has forged a personal relationship with MBS, as he's known, overriding concerns of many here that, in fact, he was not so much a liberal reformer as someone consolidating power and cracking down on dissidents. So you see this case kind of bringing all those concerns together. And there's a real question, of course, of the judgment of the Trump administration and also the politics.
Right. And Susan, speaking of the politics, the president came right out and said this is about jobs, potentially. He says $110 billion in orders from the Saudi Arabia, which is, that's orders to come, not already booked. But, and that's really, he said, I wouldn't want to do anything that would endanger that.
But other policymakers may have other views on what price are you willing to put on the life of a U.S. resident who is a dissident journalist who is lured to his country's embassy and then dismembered, we believe. And with the idea that there may be recordings of this, I think escalates this. It's been no surprise to anybody in Washington that Saudi Arabia has a very questionable record when it comes to human rights. But is this a bridge too far when it comes to these contracts? And you saw the discomfort in your interview with Marco Rubio with the way the president had expressed this concern as though these contracts would necessarily override whatever you might want to do to sanction Saudi Arabia if this is indeed is what happened.
Jonah, where do you think this fits in America first? Because the president, in a sense, is saying something that maybe previous presidents wouldn't have said it out loud, but they would put America's interests, multifaceted interests. We should also mention that Saudi Arabia is a great counterweight to Iran for the United States. And maybe he's just saying out loud what previous presidents just wouldn't have said out loud, but that there are American jobs to be thought about here, and that this is perfectly in keeping with President Trump's kind of vision of foreign policy.
I think it is perfectly in keeping. And, when he says, I don't want to jeopardize this $110 billion in orders, I wish someone would ask him, okay, so how many journalists does Saudi Arabia get to kill before it might jeopardize it, right? I mean, this is a problem with the rhetoric, and it's also a problem with the relationship. It makes a lot of sense to me, or at least it's perfectly defensible, to have a better relationship with Saudi Arabia, to work this out as a counterweight to Iran. All of those things are fine, or at least defensible. But it has to be, when you get into this situation, it is clear that no one communicated to Saudi Arabia that if we're going to go down this path, you cannot embarrass us or put us in a situation like this. And so now we're at this stage where there are no really very good options. The White House is in a bind on this, and it's because they went down this cul-de-sac to begin with without a proper line of communication. Someone led the Saudi Arabian government to believe that they could get away with this, that this wouldn't be a problem, and that's why it's a mess now.
And Susan, maybe some people are arguing what led the Saudis to believe this is not a lot of scolding on what is happening in Yemen, and that there's a pattern here of basically saying either explicitly or implicitly, we're not going to mess with your sovereignty.
Absolutely. I think this is going to emerge as a case study of why words do matter in the Trump presidency. And Jonah's point is a very important one. What have we seen that's different from President Trump from his predecessors, Democrat and Republican? I would say that it's so much more of a transactional view of America's position in the world. And that is something that's quite different. Certainly, you've had criticism of even Barack Obama for not emphasizing human rights as much as others. But you've never had a president before who called journalists the enemy of the people. Now, if you are the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, do you think you might factor that into your calculation about what you could do with this particular dissident journalist when you have your good friend and ally, the president, say that journalists are enemies of the people? I think it's a really interesting example. Also, values no longer figures in American foreign policy in the way that it has in the past.
Although the president was visited yesterday by Pastor Andrew Brunson, who was released from Turkey based on pressure the president had put. And so the president's supporters are rightly pointing out that were it not for the president, he'd still be in jail.
And the president notes correctly that he has gotten several people who had been held in North Korea and elsewhere, and got them returned to the United States, and that's a fair point. Although the bizarre element of that moment, I thought, was not the prayer, because understandably the pastor would say a prayer of gratitude of being back, but the president then asking him, "Let me ask you, did you vote for me in 2016?" When, of course, he was imprisoned in Turkey.
Well, and it's, again, your supporters. The thing is not that, human rights has become another tool in the partisan arsenal, I think is the big transition there. That's a great example of it.
Right. Jonah, let me switch topics here to a departure from the administration. UN Secretary Nikki Haley is leaving. It was extraordinary this week to see an event at the White House where she said, "I've had a great time," and it was all quite orderly. Mm-hmm. We have not seen all departures from the administration happen in an orderly fashion. What do you make of it?
Yeah, it's great. She wasn't left on a tarmac, for example. Full disclosure, my wife works for Nikki Haley, and so I'm conflicted and biased about this, but I think you can make a persuasive case that she's arguably, first of all, she's probably the most popular politician in America right now, when you think about it. If you look at her poll ratings and among Democrats and independents, also among pro-Trump conservatives and anti-Trump conservatives, she's kind of a unifying figure. And I think her timing in all of this was, either lucky or brilliant. No other person who has worked for the Trump administration has seen their reputation enhanced in the process. And she's getting out while the getting is good by doing it this way. It won't look like she's abandoning a sinking ship if the midterms go south on the Republicans. And I'm looking forward to find out what happens with her next.
Susan Page, what Jonah says is amazing when you think about where Nikki Haley once was in 2016, giving the Republican response to the Democratic president. She talked about angry voices within the Republican Party, which nobody mistook for anything but a shot at Donald Trump. Yet then she goes into the cabinet and goes into the administration and is now leaving, managed pretty nicely. Does this give me your thoughts on that? And then also, let's just give me your thoughts on it.
We obsess about the 2020 Democratic presidential lineup, but if you want to look a little farther down the road for the Republicans, I think you'd have to include Nikki Haley on that list, which is a remarkable thing. For a minority woman to win election as governor in South Carolina and then win re-election and then criticize President Trump as a candidate and then turn around and become one of his most prominent spokespersons on foreign policy shows a remarkable nimbleness and political skill. And she emerges from this, as you say, enhanced. And can you think of another example of someone who has come into the administration, served the president, had the president praise her, and emerge without criticism, really, even from those
just
who criticize?
Very quickly, to pick up on the point that Sue made earlier, she was the one figure in the administration who actually did talk about values and human rights around the world and got away with it in a way that someone else in the administration might not have.
What does that mean then, Susan Glasser, for the foreign policy? Does this tell us anything about the current makeup of the foreign policy team? And then what does it mean going forward?
Well, just a quick thing. I do think nimble is a very charitable word, for somebody who has really, Donald Trump hasn't changed, but many of his critics have changed in how they approach and frame him. She did leave the Oval Office saying that Jared Kushner was a hidden genius in the administration the same week that this Saudi controversy has arisen. And this goes to the point of, what is the administration's foreign policy? Increasingly these days, I think we see a situation where it's less and less true that there's a Trump administration foreign policy and a Trump foreign policy. Since President Trump got rid of Rex Tillerson, his first Secretary of State, got rid of H.R. McMaster, replaced them with Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, both of them come out of certainly much more of a classic, very conservative, very hardline Republican foreign policy establishment. They differ on their own policy positions from President Trump, but he's made it very clear that he doesn't want to have any more public disagreements, and it appears that they have not challenge him as much, even privately, as their predecessors did. Nikki Haley is someone who did speak up repeatedly at various points in time, where she disagreed on Russia, for example, and on other aspects of foreign policy. So I think you're going to see a more Trumpian approach to the United Nations. That's also John Bolton, his very hawkish national security advisor, has made an entire career of UN bashing. They're already talking about downgrading the United Nations portfolio. With the absence of Nikki Haley, it's probably no longer going to be a cabinet level position.
Right, so a consolidation there. Let's switch to politics. Susan Page, the USA Today ran an op-ed from the president on the question of health care this week that was, well, take it from there.
So this was the editorial page, ran an op-ed, not the news side. I thought it was good that we gave the president a platform. These are the arguments he's making in rallies and as he campaigns for candidates in the midterms. There was a big furor because it was not a fact check. There wasn't a fact check article that went with it and provided context and information for readers. I thought that was a legitimate criticism. I'm glad that we eventually posted a fact check about it. It does show how inflammatory President Trump is for both sides, and how much he defines this midterm election that we're going to see in just 3 weeks.
Jonah, in the old days, if a president had written an op-ed that could have been fact-checked, somebody would have maybe lost a job or there would have been embarrassment. There is a theory out there now that in this polarized world we're in, that you in fact want to insert some things to get fact-checked. So you'll get another news cycle, and that the people you're trying to rile up are going to believe you no matter if there's a mountain of fact-checking. And so the second round, in which there is fact-checking, actually ends up distributing the message through to a larger audience, and that's then good for you. Do you see that in play here?
It might well be. I actually wrote a column about this on Hillary Clinton coming in very late in the early Kavanaugh controversy about getting something completely wrong that Kavanaugh allegedly said about birth control. And it was very strange that she would jump in after it had already been debunked by all the fact checkers. And I made exactly this argument, is that we sort of live in the republic of trolling now. And it benefits you more to be the subject, in a world of negative polarization, to be attacked by your enemies is a benefit in and of itself, even if the attack is legitimate. And I think it's a sort of spreading model of Trumpism that is infecting a lot of our politics and our media.
And yet, Susan Glasser, we have in our Battleground Tracker poll, when people are asked what issue will affect your vote, what is the most important issue to you in your vote in 2018, healthcare comes in number one, ahead of the economy and ahead of so at 70%, economy 67%, and the Supreme Court at 57%. So the president is at least talking about an issue that people really seem to care about.
Well, that's right. It's interesting that he started to do so. As you know, his major health care initiative failed, essentially, which was the repeal of Obamacare, which was something that President Trump, as well as Republican Party, for years campaigned upon. It failed by a single vote. Trump is still, interestingly, bashing the late Senator John McCain for his decisive vote on that. He did that in an interview with Fox this week, even because he understands that, they haven't really come up with a convincing answer to it. Interestingly, tax cuts doesn't figure on that list. I did the call it crazy or what you want effort of binge watching all 6 hours and 51 minutes of President Trump's 6 rallies so far. There was another one last night for my column in The New Yorker this week. So that's almost 7 hours of Trump. Interestingly, tax cuts, which was going to be the centerpiece of Republican campaigns, generally came in at about the 51-minute mark to his rallies. These are not
saving the best for last.
Well, that's right. But I think, you mentioned the issues that are top of the list, healthcare, the economy. It's not really an issues campaign if you listen to President Trump, and frankly, if you even listen to voters in your poll, the issue is President Trump. And more than any midterm election that I can remember, this genuinely, for both Republicans and Democrats, is a vote about President Trump, it seems to me.
You know, that's in part by President Trump's design.
Yes.
You know, when President Obama was very unpopular at a midterm, he tried to stay out of the news. When President George W. Bush was unpopular at a midterm, he tried to stay away. President Trump is as unpopular as they were, and he is pushing himself out there in a way we've never seen a president for a midterm election. For a president to spend 4 or 5 days a week doing rallies around the country, it makes it impossible for this election not to be about him.
Just very quickly, I thought one of the interesting data points was that Fox News stopped carrying all of his rallies all the way through, and I'm a Fox News contributor, but it was interesting.
All right, we're going to have to end it there, and we didn't talk about Kanye West. We'll be back in a moment.